tucked away at the edge of a forgotten village, hidden beneath moss-covered rooftops and drifting mist. There stands an old apothecary. The scent of steeping herbs floats through the air, and the rain falls gently, steady as the heartbeat of memory. Inside lives Era, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and careful hands. But she is more than a maker of medicines. She's a keeper of stories, a listener of secrets, a quiet mender of broken things, turning sorrow into tea, loss into lavender, and silence into warmth. Each night, when the wind goes still and the rain begins again, someone knocks on her door. They carry sorrow, a question, a memory long buried. And when they leave, they are lighter, as if something they lost has finally found its way back home. It was the kind of rain that didn't shout, didn't storm, just whispered. A gentle, steady drizzle that tapped lightly on the wooden shingles of a crooked rooftop, like fingers playing a lullaby on a worn-out harp. The sound drifted through the trees, down the winding mossy paths, across the sleepy village square, and settled finally at the edge of the forest, where a small cottage stood in quiet solitude. Inside, a warm light glowed behind fogged windows. Her name was Era. No one really remembered how long she had lived there, only that she had always been there, it seemed. The apothecary of the wood. A woman with hair silver like soft ashes, a voice like candlelight, and a house that smelled of lavender, ink, and thyme. She moved slowly, not out of frailty, but peace. Every gesture was deliberate, pouring water into a kettle, folding herbs into parchment, lighting the lanterns, though the fire had already been lit. In this house, nothing was rushed. Not stories, not memories, not healing. Outside, the rain continued its quiet symphony, and the wind moved gently through the trees, like an old friend. Inside, the wooden floor creaked in all the right places, and a black cat snored softly atop a shelf of dried chamomile. The shop was closed to the world tonight, not because no one was welcome, but because some nights were not meant for visitors. Some nights were meant for remembering. Era poured herself a cup of tea from a chipped pot painted with violets. The scent of wild mint and rosemary curled up from the cup like steam from a memory. She sat by the fire, the worn chair creaking familiarly beneath her, and reached for a heavy book wrapped in green leather and string. The cover had no title, only the faint outline of a leaf pressed into its surface, as though once alive. She untied the string. The book opened, not with a crack, but with a sigh. Pages thick and yellowed, filled with ink that shimmered faintly under the lantern light. She turned to a page marked with a pressed petal, brittle and blue. And then, in that quiet room filled with the scent of tea and the sound of rain, she began to read. Not aloud. Not yet. First, she let the story rise, softly, gently, from the page to her lips, like a scent remembered from childhood. The past always arrived this way in her cottage, slow, lingering, and full of wonder. The cat stirred, the fire flickered, the rain grew just a little louder, and the first story began, not with once upon a time, but with the rustle of a boy's footsteps on the rainy path, approaching a door he was almost too afraid to knock on. The boy hesitated at the doorstep. His boots were soaked through, and rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of his hood. He was no older than 12, thin, sharp elbows poking through a cloak one size too big, cheeks red with wind, and hands curled tightly around a small cloth bundle pressed to his chest. He looked up at the crooked wooden sign that swung gently above the door, worn by time and softened by moss. No words, just the image of a curled fern and a crescent moon. He took a breath, then another, and knocked. The sound was hardly more than a pat against the old wood, almost drowned by the rain. But inside, Era heard it clearly, as clearly as she would have heard a bell in the quiet of night. She did not startle. She did not rush. She simply placed a ribbon in her book, set her tea down, and rose with the ease of someone used to being needed. She opened the door. The boy blinked up at her, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak first or flee. Era didn't say anything. She only stepped aside, allowing the warm light to spill out onto the porch, beckoning him inward. He entered slowly. The scent of thyme and honey surrounded him. The floor creaked beneath his feet. The fire, glowing in the hearth, cast golden shadows across rows of apothecary bottles, some filled with powder, others with oils, and some with things that shimmered when no one looked directly at them. He didn't speak until she offered him a towel, and even then it came out in a whisper. "My mother's sick." Ira nodded once, gently, as if he had told her a full story. "She won't wake," he added, "but she's still breathing." She poured him a cup of warm cider from a second pot near the fire. "And what have you brought?" The boy hesitated, then unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside was a single delicate flower. Its petals were a pale glowing silver despite the rain. Each drop that fell on it rolled off like mercury, never soaking in. Era's eyes softened. "Moonfern," she said. He nodded. "I found it in the grove behind the river, just like she used to tell me in stories." Era smiled faintly. "Not many your age would go looking for something that only grows under rain and sorrow." The boy's lip trembled. "I didn't know if it was real." "Most things worth finding feel that way," she said kindly. She took the flower with careful hands, then set it beside a bowl of warm water on the counter. From the shelves, she chose a vial, the colour of morning fog, and a handful of dried bark that smelled like sleep. The boy watched her every move, not with fear, but with the stillness of someone carrying too much. Era worked silently, letting the soft crackle of the fire and the hush of the rain fill the space between them. When the tonic was ready, she poured it into a small glass bottle and wrapped it in thick cloth. 3 drops on her tongue," she instructed. "At midnight, before the rain stops." He took the bottle, hands trembling. "I don't have anything to pay you with," he said quietly. Era crouched down to meet his eyes. "You brought me a moonfern," she said. "That's something most people never even believe in. But that wasn't for you." "Ah," she said, a smile forming. "But you trusted me with it. And that, my dear boy, is more precious than coin." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, without warning, wrapped his arms around her in a tight, sudden hug. It lasted only a second. Then he was gone, out into the rain, footsteps fading into the forest path. Era stood at the doorway, watching him disappear into the mist. She didn't worry. Some stories didn't need watching over. They simply needed to be told. She returned to her chair, refilled her tea, and reopened the green leather book. The fire popped softly. The rain shifted against the windows, and a new page turned. The storm had grown heavier. Rain now fell in velvet sheets, pattering against the windows like 1,000 soft fingers, and the scent of wet earth curled through the cracks in the wooden walls. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called out, a low, steady note that echoed and faded like a thought left unfinished. Aira sat with her book open, a half-written page resting gently beneath her fingertips. The ink shimmered faintly, still wet, dancing to the rhythm of the flickering lantern. Then came the knock. 3 slow taps. Not timid, not urgent, simply present. She looked up, already knowing this visitor was unlike the last. Some knocks carried questions, some carried fear, and some, like this one, carried silence that had waited a very long time to be heard. She rose, her shawl slipping gently around her shoulders, and walked to the door. Outside stood a man cloaked in grey. His hood was deep, shadowing most of his face, but the rain slid off him without soaking the fabric, as though it knew better than to touch him. In his arms he cradled a wooden box, not large, not ornate, just old, worn by time, bound in iron bands, and sealed with no visible lock. Only a single rune etched into the lid, glowing faintly like coal beneath ash. He said nothing. Aira nodded once, stepping aside. He entered silently, his boots leaving no trail despite the wet. The fire flared briefly as if recognizing him, then settled into a soft, low burn. He did not remove his cloak, did not sit, did not speak. He simply placed the box gently on the counter and waited. Aira approached, her eyes on the rune. She didn't touch the box, not yet. She only looked. "This hasn't been opened," she said quietly, "since the morning years." The man didn't respond, but he didn't need to. There was a stillness around him that didn't ask for explanation. It simply existed. Aira moved to a nearby shelf and retrieved a small vial filled with something pale and silver, like liquid breath. She uncorked it, dipped a thin brush into the contents, and traced a circle of protection around the box. The air inside the room shifted, like the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. She looked at the man. "Do you want to remember?" she asked. He shook his head once. "Then why bring it here?" He finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, like stone smoothed by rivers. "Because this house remembers for me." Aira nodded again, as though the answer had been expected. She did not open the box. She did not ask what was inside. Instead, she returned to her chair, poured a second cup of tea, and placed it gently on the table beside her. The man took the other chair, and for a while they simply sat. No questions, no answers. Only rain, only firelight, only the weight of something unnamed, resting between them like an old song without lyrics. Eventually, the man rose. He did not take the box. He left it behind, just as he had left behind the words he never said. At the door, he paused, and for the first time, lifted his hood. His eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many memories in silence. Aira bowed her head slightly. "You're always welcome." He gave a faint nod, and then he was gone, swallowed by the night and the rain. The box sat on the counter, still closed, still humming quietly in the space around it. Aira didn't move to touch it. Some things, she knew, didn't need to be opened to be understood. They only needed to be honoured. She placed a small candle beside it and let it burn through the night. And as the fire cracked and the rain whispered, she returned to her book, the next story rising gently from its pages like mist from morning soil. The rain eased into a mist by morning. Fog clung to the treetops like a soft scarf, and the damp earth exhaled the scent of moss and renewal. Light filtered through the apothecary windows in dappled gold, casting quiet shapes onto the wooden floor. Aira was already awake. She moved through her morning ritual with silent care, watering the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, turning the pages of a half-read recipe book, stirring a pot of honeyed root broth over the fire. The grey box still sat on the counter, untouched, but the candle beside it had burned low, and the air around it had stilled, as if the box too had found rest. Just as Ira was tying up a bundle of sage, she heard footsteps, not hurried, not clumsy, small, light, barely brushing the stone path leading to her door. Then, a knock. She opened the door to find a girl standing there, no more than 10 winters old, cheeks rosy from the cold. She wore a faded green shawl and carried a basket wrapped in linen, clasped tightly to her chest. "I brought these for you," the girl said, offering the basket without introduction. Ira smiled. "Come in, little one. It smells like clouds out here." The girl giggled softly and stepped inside, immediately glancing around with wide, curious eyes. She took in the rows of tiny glass bottles, the bundles of dried roots, the ceiling filled with herbs, and the black cat curled up on a high shelf like a well-fed guardian. "It's just like she said," the girl whispered. "Who said?" Era asked gently, taking the basket. "My grandma. She used to tell me stories about the woman in the woods who kept time in bottles and kindness in her tea." Era's hand paused on the basket's edge. "What is your grandmother's name?" "Marna." That name settled like dust in the quiet of the room. Marna of the Southern Valley. A woman with laugh lines etched deep into her cheeks, who once traded stories for pain balm and had a voice like winter wind softened with cinnamon. She hadn't come through the apothecary in decades. "She passed last spring," the girl said softly, eyes lowering. Era placed a hand over her heart. "She was a bright spark." The girl nodded. "Before she went, she told me she still owed you something, from long ago, and she made me promise to deliver this basket." Ira lifted the linen cloth. Inside, a simple bouquet of flowers. Not rare, not exotic, just the kind that grew wild along the paths of the old southern fields. Sunbloom, soft ivy, whisper lily, and 3 pale blue forget-me-nots tied with twine. It wasn't payment. It was remembrance. "She told me," the girl added, "that kindness given should always be returned, even if the world forgets." Era blinked slowly, then gave the girl a warm, steady smile. "And the world never truly forgets when kindness is passed down." The girl looked up at her with that innocent, unwavering trust that only children and the very old seem to carry with ease. Era poured her a small cup of honey tea, sweetened with a sprig of mint. As the girl drank, Era tucked a bundle of dried herbs into her satchel. Chamomile, fennel, a bit of marshmallow root. "For your journey home," she said, "to help you sleep on rainy nights." The girl nodded solemnly, as though receiving a treasure. When she left, the house felt brighter. Not louder, just fuller. Era placed the basket of flowers on the shelf above her writing desk, beside a jar labelled Marna, 47 years ago. Laughter, raspberries, and lightning balm. She didn't open the jar, but she smiled at it and the flowers beside it and whispered, "Debt repaid." And as the mist clung gently to the trees outside, she returned to her book, where the next story already waited between the lines. Evening came slowly, wrapped in the hush of steady rain. Outside, the trees stood still as statues, their wet leaves glistening like old coins under the dim grey light. The wind didn't howl, it sighed, long and low, brushing gently against the apothecary windows as if asking to be let in. Era sat at her work table, grinding dried anise into a fine powder. The scent was sweet and earthy, clinging to the edges of the room like a memory. The bell above the door did not ring. It never did. But she looked up all the same. The door creaked open, and in stepped an old man in a woolen coat patched at the elbows, boots caked with wet soil, and a flat cap soaked from the rain. In his arms, wrapped in a silk cloth far too fine for a rainy day, was a clock. Not a large one, just a pocket watch, tarnished, worn, but with a delicate carving on the front, 2 birds in flight, their wings entwined in a loop of ivy. Aira greeted him with a nod, already pulling a second mug from the shelf. Time tea today? He gave a tired smile. If you please. He sat near the fire, shoulders rounded not from cold, but from the weight of years. The clock sat quietly on his knee, its chain wrapped twice around his fingers. Ira handed him the cup. He accepted it with both hands, careful, grateful, then looked down at the clock. It's been stopping, he said quietly. Same time, every night. She tilted her head. And what time is that? 3:17. She paused. Morning or afternoon? He smiled faintly. Morning. Always morning. She nodded slowly, glancing toward the flickering fire. And what happens at 3:17? The man's fingers tightened slightly around the clock. His eyes drifted not to the fire, nor to her, but to something far away. That's when she used to wake, he said. Every morning, before the sun. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. She would hum, he continued, just loud enough to stir me, but soft enough not to wake the birds. And she'd make tea, with cardamom, not cinnamon, because she said mornings should have spice, not sugar. He chuckled, the sound brittle and warm. Even now, I swear I smell it sometimes. Era listened, hands resting gently in her lap. I wound the clock the morning she passed, he said. Didn't want it to stop. Didn't want anything else to stop. Silence settled for a moment, like a blanket pulled gently across a room. But then one night, he said, I woke in the dark, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I looked at the clock, and it had stopped. Era's voice was soft. 3:17. He nodded once. I wound it again, and again the next night, but it keeps stopping. Same time. He looked up at her now, eyes not filled with tears, but with a question too quiet for words. I don't want you to fix it, he said. I just wanted to know if it means something. Era stood, walked to her shelf, and returned with a small tin. She opened it to reveal dried petals, pale blue and silver-edged. Widow's breath, they were called. Flowers that bloomed once and then never again, unless planted beside something dearly loved. She placed 3 petals into a small muslin sachet and handed it to him. Keep this near the clock, she said. Not to stop it, not to start it, just to keep it company. He took the sachet, held it as gently as he had held the clock. Then, with a quiet sigh, he tucked both into his coat. Thank you, he whispered. For listening? For remembering, Era replied. He rose, tipped his damp hat, and stepped back into the rain, which, for the first time that evening, seemed to fall with rhythm, like the soft ticking of something long paused, now beating again, not with urgency, but with memory. Era returned to her chair. Outside, the clouds thickened, the sky deepened to the colour of steeped tea, and at exactly 3:17 the next morning, in a house several miles away, a clock stopped once more, and somewhere nearby The faintest scent of cardamom drifted through the air. The house was unusually still that night. The fire had burned low, and outside the rain had softened into a kind of hush, more like mist than water, as though the sky itself was only sighing. The trees barely moved, their branches holding hands in silence. Inside the apothecary, every light had been dimmed except one, the lantern by the kitchen window, where Era sat with a faded piece of embroidery in her lap. Her fingers worked slowly, threading a line of pale blue into the shape of a leaf that curved gently toward a corner already filled with stars. She didn't hear a knock. She didn't expect one. But her head lifted anyway, and her eyes drifted towards the front door, because the bell above the porch, the small copper wind chime that had hung there for over 40 years, gave a soft, clear ring, once, then again. It was the kind of sound that should have needed wind, but the air outside was perfectly still, and Era smiled. She set her embroidery down, stood with quiet grace, and walked toward the door. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for a small wooden stool just beside the doorway and placed it gently on the porch. Then she returned inside and poured a second cup of tea, the same blend she made every midsummer: blackberry leaf, lemon balm, and a pinch of thyme. She placed the second cup across from her own seat. Then, for a while, she said nothing, because some visitors didn't need to be seen. They only needed to be known. The room warmed, just slightly, as if someone else had entered, bringing with them the soft scent of elderflower and dusty parchment. It was familiar, deeply familiar. Era looked at the empty seat and chuckled softly. "You're late," she murmured. The lantern flickered in response. She lifted her cup and took a slow sip. "You always liked this tea," she added, "even though you pretended you didn't." Silence answered. But it wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone listening, the kind of quiet that made room for presence. "I've kept everything just as you left it," she said, glancing toward the shelf near the fire. "Even your jar of old clove sticks. They're probably dust now, but I couldn't throw them away." She paused, then smiled gently. "They still smell like you." Outside, the bell rang once more, just once, and the wind picked up the faintest breeze, enough to rustle the ivy hanging by the windows. Ira closed her eyes for a moment. Then she reached for a second piece of embroidery, older, more faded, and worn soft by time. It was a small handkerchief, stitched with 2 initials, L.A. She held it gently in her palm. "You taught me how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip," she said. "Not just with thread, but with people." Her voice didn't shake. There was no sorrow in it, only softness. "I thought of you when the moon fern bloomed this spring. I knew you would have pressed a petal between pages." Another flicker of light danced across the wall, then faded, and slowly the scent of elderflower drifted away. The second cup of tea sat untouched, but not unwelcome. Era did not clear it. She let it stay. Some goodbyes didn't need to be said again. They only needed to be remembered. The night grew deeper, and as the fire dimmed and the mist thickened around the cottage, the bell above the door rang one final time. Quiet, distant, and full of memory. Then peace. Era returned to her chair, the handkerchief still in her lap, and opened her book once more. And as the pages turned, the next story rose like steam from a forgotten cup of tea, curling into the air, soft and unseen, but very much alive. The rain had returned, Not heavy, just present. A steady rhythm tapping across the wooden shingles, threading itself between the cracks of old shutters and settling gently into the soil, like a secret being whispered back to the earth. Era was sorting dried roots by lantern light, humming something that had no words. Her black cat had taken to the windowsill, eyes blinking slowly at the drizzle outside. Then came the knock. 2 quick taps, then a pause, then one more. Era looked up, her hand still resting on a ribbon of valerian. She opened the door. A girl stood there, young, maybe 17, though her eyes carried a shadow far older. Her cloak was soaked, her boots caked in mud, and both hands clutched tightly around something wrapped in a damp scrap of cloth. The girl began, voice shaky. I think I need help. Ira stepped aside, the scent of sage and smoke welcoming the girl in. She didn't ask what was wrong. Not yet. The girl moved carefully, as if the floor might collapse beneath her weight. She looked around the apothecary, not with curiosity, but with cautious awe, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be here. Ira gestured toward the hearth. Warm yourself. The girl knelt beside the fire. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she unwrapped the cloth in her lap. Inside was a single mushroom, delicate, translucent, glowing softly from within, like moonlight trapped beneath a layer of pearl. Ira knelt beside her. Where did you find this? The girl didn't look up. Her voice was a whisper. It grew. Where I was buried. Silence fell like snow. Ira did not react with shock, only stillness. She waited, and after a long breath the girl spoke again, voice steadier now, though no louder. I don't remember how I got out. I just woke up underground, cold, no air, no space. And this, she looked down at the mushroom, was next to me, growing from my chest. She placed a hand over her ribs, as if to confirm she was real. Era nodded slowly. It's called night gloom. The girl blinked. It has a name? All things do, Iris said. But some are only spoken in places most people never return from. The fire crackled gently. The cat, sensing something, leapt down from the windowsill and curled against the girl's side. She didn't flinch. She simply placed a hand on its back, almost surprised by how warm it felt. I don't know why I'm alive, she murmured. You don't have to know tonight, Era replied. She stood, moved to a tall cabinet, and pulled out a ceramic jar etched with spiral vines. From it, she took a pinch of crushed seed, pale green and dust fine. She brewed a tea, dark and earthy, with a sweetness that only arrived at the very end. This will help you sleep, she said, placing the mug into the girl's hands. You've come back from deep soil. That kind of silence clings to the skin. The girl sipped, and something in her eyes softened. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of rest. Era reached forward and lifted the mushroom gently from the cloth. It pulsed softly in her palm. Night gloom only grows from grief, she said, but it doesn't feed on pain. It remembers it, and glows so others can find their way through. The girl looked at her. So I'm not cursed. Era smiled. You're marked, and that is not the same thing. The girl finished her tea in silence, then curled up on the small daybed beside the hearth. The cat pressed close to her chest. She slept quickly, like someone who hadn't slept in years. Aira placed the mushroom in a glass dome beside her workstation, not to contain it, but to honor it. Its glow did not fade. Neither did the memory of the girl who had walked through death and knocked softly on a door, lit only by rain. Morning broke with a softness that rarely lasted. The rain had lifted, leaving the forest dripping quietly under early light. Dew clung to every leaf and spiderweb, and the air was filled with the scent of damp bark and mossy stone. Birds sang not in chorus, but in scattered sleepy whistles, as if still waking from their own dreams. Inside the apothecary, Era swept the floor with slow, even strokes. The cat, no longer perched on high shelves, stretched lazily beside the fire. A kettle boiled gently in the background, steam curling toward the rafters like a sigh. Then the door creaked. No knock, just the sound of a latch gently moving, as though the house itself had chosen to open. Era turned. A child stood in the doorway, no taller than her kitchen counter, no older than 3. Wide brown eyes, tangled curls, cheeks flushed from the brisk morning air. The little one said nothing, just looked at her. Era smiled and knelt. "Well, hello." The child blinked slowly, then reached into a pocket and produced a piece of folded paper. He walked forward on unsteady feet and placed it on the counter. Then, without a word, he turned around and sat cross-legged by the hearth, as if he belonged there, as if he had always belonged there. Ira picked up the paper. It was thick, old, the edges frayed, the creases worn soft, folded with the kind of care a child's hands couldn't manage. She opened it and paused. Written inside, in a hand she hadn't seen in over 20 years, was a single word. Callan. Her breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable. Looping. Precise. With the faintest tilt to the right. She'd seen it last in a letter tucked under a tin of dried marigold petals. A letter from a woman named Elsha. Elsha, who had died the winter after her son was born. Elsha, who had once told Era, in a voice half broken by fever, "If something ever happens to me, and he finds his way to you, you'll know it's him." Era closed her eyes. She hadn't thought of Callan in years. He'd been a baby then, barely walking, taken in by a travelling family, last she'd heard. But here he was, not asking, not speaking, just present, holding the silence like it was something sacred. She knelt beside him. "Would you like some honey milk?" He nodded. Still no words, but his hands, when he took the cup, were steady, and his eyes never left hers. As he drank, Era watched the folded paper on the table. She didn't question how it had come back. She didn't ask how a child could carry a name across so many years, so many paths, to land at her door on the first dry morning after a month of rain. Some things didn't arrive on roads. Some things were carried by memory, or something older than that. She fetched a small blanket from the cupboard and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then she took the paper and tucked it into her book of names. A book that only had first pages, never final ones. The child finished his drink, and when he looked up again, there was something knowing in his gaze. Not words, just a recognition. A soul remembering another. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, warm light spilling across jars and windows, Era whispered, "Welcome home, little Caitlin." And the house, ever quiet and listening, seemed to hum in agreement. Thunder came like a distant drum. It rolled low across the hills and settled into the trees, making the glass bottles on Era's shelves hum almost imperceptibly. Rain tapped harder now. Not the soft kind, but the steady rhythm of something waking up inside the clouds. Wind curled under the eaves like fingers looking for a door left ajar. Era lit a second lantern. Storms had their own kind of visitors. Sure enough, before the hour was out, the door opened. He didn't knock. He only entered, as if the storm itself had guided his hand. The man was tall, wrapped in a cloak the colour of worn parchment. His hair was silver, but not from age, more like the silver of moonlight reflected on still water. His eyes were closed behind a thin cloth band, but he moved without hesitation. Perched on his shoulder was a great owl, feathers damp, eyes bright, utterly silent. Ira didn't speak, not right away. She simply watched as the man stepped inside and removed his hood. The owl shifted slightly, but stayed. He stood near the fire and said, in a voice low and certain, "I don't want to see the world. I want to see the last thing I forgot." The words settled heavily in the room, not like a demand, more like a key fitting into a very old lock. Era walked slowly to the far wall, where a shelf sat half hidden behind a curtain of dried lavender. From it, she pulled a narrow wooden box. Inside were 3 vials, one filled with dew from the first frost, one filled with ash from a burned memory, and one filled with a clear, shimmering liquid that caught the light like shifting glass. She brought them to the work table and began to blend. The owl blinked. The man said nothing more, only turned his face slightly as though listening, not to her, but to something beneath the floor, or behind the fire, or within the storm. When the brew was ready, Ira poured it into a small clay cup. She did not hand it to him. Instead, she placed it on the table, between them. "You must drink," she said softly, "but only when you are ready. This won't give you sight. It will give you truth. And truth," she paused, "has its own weight." The man nodded, and drank. For a moment nothing happened. Then he exhaled, not with surprise, but with recognition. The owl fluttered down from his shoulder and landed gently on the counter. Its feathers ruffled once, then lay still. The man's hands opened at his sides, and then his lips moved, not in words, in breath. He saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. And what he saw, only he would ever know. Tears fell down his cheeks, not of sorrow, not of joy, but of release, of memory returning like a wave long held back by stone. When it was done, he bowed his head and spoke. She had flowers in her hair. Era didn't ask who she was. Some names weren't meant to be repeated aloud. She walked to a drawer beneath the apothecary's scale and took out a small cloth satchel filled with dried petals, heliotrope, and cornflower for memory, for softness. She handed it to him without a word. He tucked it into the folds of his coat. The owl returned to his shoulder. As he turned to leave, he paused by the door. Though his eyes were still covered, he seemed to look directly at her. "You don't keep time in this house," he said. "You keep memory." And with that, he stepped into the rain, the owl lifting silently into the night air behind him. Era stood by the open door for a moment, watching the storm wash through the trees. Somewhere in the dark, a soft hoot echoed. Once, then again. Then she closed the door. The tea in her cup had gone cold, but the room was warmer than before, and her book, still open on the desk, had begun a new page, blank, waiting, patient as ever. The night was still. For the first time in what felt like many moons, there was no rain, no wind brushing the eaves, no thunder rumbling in the distance. Just quiet, the kind that lives between heartbeats. A quiet so complete, even the fire seemed to crackle softer, more reverently. The forest beyond the apothecary stood unmoving, bathed in silver from a gentle moon. And inside the little wooden house, everything was where it had always been. the bottles resting like silent watchers on their shelves, the herbs hanging in dry, fragrant rows, the chair by the hearth, the cat curled into a perfect spiral, dreaming of nothing urgent, and Ira, alone at her desk. She sat with a cup of jasmine tea untouched beside her. The steam had long since vanished, but she didn't notice. Her hands rested on the cover of a leather-bound journal, newer than the others, its corners still sharp, its pages still clean. She opened to the first page, blank. She stared at it for a long time. Then, with a breath as steady as the stars outside, she dipped her pen into ink and began to write. My name is Aira. I am not a healer. Not only. I'm a witness, a keeper, a vessel. And I've watched stories pass through this place like wind through the trees. But tonight, I remember mine. Her pen moved slowly. There was no need to rush. She wrote of the first time she ever gathered chamomile at dawn, her fingers trembling from the cold and from fear of doing it wrong. She wrote of the woman who once taught her the language of roots. Not just how they worked, but how they waited. She wrote of the door that never stayed closed for long, of visitors who brought pain wrapped in silence, and how sometimes the best medicine was a warm cup and an ear that didn't interrupt. She wrote of laughter that stayed in the wood grain, of tears soaked into the floorboards, of lives that came and went like seasons, always different, always necessary. She wrote of being tired but never weary, of being alone but never lonely. And when she reached the last line of the page, she paused, just for a moment, then added, and when I am gone, may the house remember me, the way it remembers the sound of rain, and the way memory lingers in the scent of time. She closed the book, not tightly, just gently, like one tucks a child into bed. Then she rose, walked to the hearth and fed the fire one last log, not because it was needed, but because it felt kind. The cat stirred and blinked at her, then returned to sleep. Aira smiled. She stepped out onto the porch. The stars above blinked steadily. No wind, no footsteps, no bell, just a sky full of quiet. She stood there for a long time, letting the silence hold her, and for the first time she didn't wait for a knock. She didn't expect a visitor. She was not the keeper tonight. She was simply remembered.